Ladies and gentlemen, we are back with Season 4, Episode 4. Daring Don't. Sorry, forgot to update the thing. This is the episode in which we find out that Daring Do is, gasp, real. And her adventures are real, and what A.K. Yearling does, it's definitely not a reference to Amy Keating Rogers, is actually write about her adventures that she actually goes through. And then produces them as books, probably to fund her adventures, because they're pretty well selling, but I think we'll cover that more in the future. Anyways, I know it's shocking. Ladies and gentlemen, anime is real. Nah, I'm just kidding. It's fake. Super fake. So Fluttershy gives flying lessons to the baby birds. Are there birds that abandon their young in the nest? I feel like I've read that before, but I'm not what you'd call an expert. I was just wondering, because it sounds like the kind of thing that would then lead to Fluttershy having to help the birds with how to fly, since, normally you'd think that would be their parents' job. Just something I was wondering. Not really relevant. So you remember that music bit I mentioned in the last episode? One of the most obvious examples of the new approach to the music is actually right at the beginning of the episode, when there's a conversation between Fluttershy and Rainbow Dash, and it just jumps back and forth between the two constantly as as they talk, and it's that way pretty much throughout the whole episode. It's even more obvious in this episode because we have so many Indiana Jones riffs going on here. I mean, duh, right? Now, this has to be intentional, but this is going to be one of those things where I'm going to mention something that everyone in the fandom has already mentioned. But you notice how Daring Do is actually a palette swap of Rainbow Dash. This actually got me thinking a little bit here, because I mean, duh, right? I'm sure a huge amount of ponies in Ponyville and in the series as a whole are palette swaps of each other. It's not like it is over in Mega Man, right? That's where palette swapping really came into my thing. Because, yeah, exactly, Roscoe. Because palette swapping usually is done, and it's overt and blatant, and it's just, Final Fantasy is another good example. It's how many enemies, or Zelda, how many enemies look exactly the same as another but have a different color scheme? And you could tell they're harder enemies because they're red instead of being blue or green or whatever. It's a color coding sort of a thing. Very common thing in video games. But the thing is, it's usually more obvious in video games because most creatures or enemies or whatever look substantially different from each other. Like, if you see a palette swap of Mega Man, it's really obvious that it's a palette swap of Mega Man. I don't actually know how much palette swapping they do within the regards of My Little Pony. This one really jumped out at me because Rainbow Dash actually does have a bit of a unique design. The lines that go through her hair and her mane, as well as the specific jagged nature of it, are pretty distinct. And thus, seeing them side by side was like, oh, okay, I don't think I even noticed that the last time. Which, I'm kind of trying to dance around a topic. First, Rainbow Dash. Yeah, I suppose. Let's just go ahead and jump into this. Let's just make this nice and obvious. So this is in a couple of ways an episode about fandom. And there's no nice way to talk about fandom. Really, there isn't. Because any fandom is going to fall prey to sample size theory. If fandom gets too big, you're going to have people that are... Now, I got to clarify that a little bit, because some people think I'm a little bit because I sit here discussing Star Trek on the internet, or analyzing video game design or whatever, and that some people think that that's going too far. Now, how far is too far is of course up to you, but in my opinion, there are some people that cross a very definitive and obvious line of too far. Now you'll notice right towards the beginning of the episode actually bothers to make it clear in, I think, 4 separate ways that Rainbow Dash is someone who goes too far. First of all, Rainbow Dash misses out on a party that she was invited to because she was busy reading. Okay, that's not actually too bad. You know, that's all right. That's whatever. But, you know, second thing, she brings up how she is a super fan, and you know, I'm the biggest fan. How could anybody possibly know anything more than me? Which leads immediately to the third problem, which is the competitive nature of super fans. Now, we just talked last episode about friendly competition. And, yeah, I know, right, Raskor? And there's nothing actually wrong. Hang on, that's the fourth point. There's nothing actually wrong with friendly competition. But I cannot even begin to tell you how many times I have seen superfans of, you name it, who have gotten unpleasantly competitive over which one of them is more of a superfan. Like, I'm not talking, you know, having random trivia stuff about, you know, episodes of Star Trek. I'm talking about people who are trying to discuss the number of eyelashes that Deanna Troi has for a certain episode. That's a real example. Or, you know, exactly how many different episodes they have in how many different formats. This is another real example. I knew a guy who was arguing with another guy that he was a bigger fan. This is still Star Trek, by the way. Because he had... oh god, what was it? He had like the original episodes in VHS, and then he sealed those away in an airtight container, and then he had like backup copies which he could actually watch or something. It was this whole thing. I actually don't remember all the steps he went through. And yeah, it could also be something relatively simple, you know. I could walk up to Raskor and say, Raskor, I personally prefer... I guess I'd say Picard if I had to pick, over Kirk. And Raskor says, well, I prefer Kirk over Picard. Well, we could talk about that. But then some people who, in my opinion, cross the line, don't talk about that. They screech about that, and they rant about that, and they argue about that, and they fight about that. I mean, how could you possibly think Kirk is... But do you know how many women Kirk has slept with? What kind of a man would actually... And meanwhile, you're like, oh, well, Picard, at least Kirk is a real man, whereas Picard constantly runs away from every problem and won't even raise a fist to help his own crew if it's necessary. And... Which, of course, leads me to point 4. Now, this one is one I've actually experienced personally as a content creator. Ect actually shared the quote here, so I'll just read what he said. It's obviously delayed because she needs help dealing with whatever nonsense is distracting her from spending her every living, breathing second writing. Now, that is stated as a joke, but let's say that how it is. Let's clarify that into real-life terminology. I want my content creators, whether it's a TV show or video game or book or movie or an anime or comic or whatever, I want them to burn out so that I can get content faster. How many times have you heard that one? And again, I have heard that one personally as someone who makes YouTube videos and streams. I've shared with you guys occasional stories about people who are asking why I don't actually make more content than I do. Why I don't do additional work on top of what I do. I work 7 days a week, by the way. For those of you not aware of that. And I point this out. That's the one that hit most personally for me. But I point this out because I've heard that a lot from plenty of people, not even related to me. Oh, I wish the next episode would come out now soon. Why is the next book taking so long? Why do we have to wait so long for the next game to come out? Etc. Now, in the interest of fairness, sometimes this can get into extremes. You know, there are some book series that'll probably never come out at this point. How long have we been waiting on Game of Thrones? And the, I can't even remember the name of it now. Shoot. Hang on. To YouTube, or Google, rather. You have to give me a second here, because I can't think of his friggin' name. Patrick Rothfuss. Who has still, like last I checked, still has not actually released the last of his books. Although, granted, I haven't actually checked in over a year at this point, so maybe he did? I don't know. Yeah, Sci-Fi Debris actually did have a mental breakdown late last year, Raskor. From burnout. Poor guy. Now, point being, I have seen that... So, obviously, in certain circumstances, obviously, yeah, get off your duff. Honestly, Doom 5's music probably qualifies as an example of that. But my point is, I do think the overwhelming majority of people are unreasonable when it comes to that. And I wanted to bring that one up because... Yeah, exactly. Because... God, I don't even know how to phrase this. Rainbow obviously is too much of a fan, and they do demonstrate that. But that fourth point hit the most solidly because normal fans have that problem. Normal people who do not go too far have the problem of insisting on more content faster. Pure theory, but I have speculated over the years that that mostly comes from a total lack of understanding. That some people think that, you know, it either doesn't take the amount of time and effort that it does, or think, and this is a fallacy I've seen many, many times, that creative work is exactly the same as non-creative work. In other words, most people think, and Ek just mentioned this, most people tend to have this impression that if you, writing a book, you know, writing a novel, to use a direct example, is the exact same relative process as digging up a ditch. You know, you put work into it and work comes out of it in a fairly linear manner. But anybody who has a brain can tell you that creative work doesn't actually work that way. You need to be creative. Creativity can't just be forced in a linear and sequential process, unless you're on drugs. So you can't just automatically put more time into it and then automatically get more resources out of it, which is a huge, huge problem, and the kind of thing that video game developers could probably learn to learn as well. And by video game developers, I mean video game managers, development company managers, the people who are actually in charge, who seem to think that just by making people work, 70-hour work weeks, they'll make better games. Because that's how that works, right? And yeah, Stephen King is the drugs example. Anyways, I'm getting off topic. Yeah, that's another thing. I've actually only ever really finished one true campaign in D&D or whatever. It wasn't actually D&D, it was my own city. But you know what I mean. I've only finished one tabletop campaign. That one was over like 5 years. We did it. We did conclude it. It's almost like that will directly influence the quality. Anyways, I'm sorry, we got way off topic here. But yeah, I had to comment on this. I had to comment on this because they clearly and obviously show that Rainbow is going too far, but they had to add that fourth bit in there. They had to slide that fourth point in. And that one just kind of was like, oof. Anyways. They do show Twilight in immediate contrast to Rainbow Dash. Twilight is someone who is, as she states, I'm arguably more of a fan than you, but she doesn't get competitive about it, first point. You'll notice that while she was listing her qualifications, she wasn't doing it with an argumentative voice, she was just stating fact, while Rainbow Dash is getting, yeah, sure, whatever. And she was doing so while just kind of moving on with her life. Punch? Now, I point that out because I think that's a far more healthy attitude to take right there. There's nothing wrong with being excited for something. Hoip is a perfectly natural and perfectly acceptable emotional reaction. But, I mean, it'll come, You've got your life in the interim. There's other things to focus on. It's cool. It's cool. Anyways. Then we have our first substantially Indiana Jones moment. See you around, Raskor. Where they actually do the map thing. Dun, 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 and apparently Pinkie Pie's actually painting a red line where they go. I mean, I guess as weird as this sounds, that actually makes sense, other than the obvious gag. The fact is that she's making sure that they know where they've been so they can backtrack. It's just an interesting way to do it. This episode actually has a lot of visual gags in general, I noticed. Again, I want to give praise to the directing. There's a bit where the birds are flying over Rainbow Dash's head, the birds that they were trying to learn how to fly earlier. Fluttershy poking in out of camera, Pinkie Pie poking in out of camera. Twilight's entire hat glows with magic when she casts while she has the party hat on, you know. There's also a bit later, which I really liked, where Daring Do approaches a broken mirror. And it's shattered in a way so the mirror's effectively in 3 pieces, so the 3 henchmen all come into focus in one of each 3 parts of the mirror. It's just good visual stuff. I hate to keep pointing it out, but screw you. I like pointing out little details like that when I think they're good, so there they are. Then Rainbow Dash starts to go too far. Part 2 of 3. Daring Do is just looking for the treasure, and Rainbow's like, also this? And then what happens is something that actually substantially irritates me. Because what happens next is a cutscene. To just use the video game terminology here. What happens next is Caballero. From what I understand, they apparently specifically pronounce the L's so that he sounds more like Belloc. Anyways, Caballero shows up, and the henchmen, and the fighting, and oh no. And they're all just watching. The main 6. Just hanging out over there. Watching. This is basically the definition of cutscene incompetence right here. There's even a bit where Fluttershy says, maybe we should help her? And the entire group, as one, is like, oh, right. I get that you're into the show, but really? Really? Now, see, that actually frustrated me, for the exact same reason that cutscene incompetence always frustrates me. This is interesting, because later Rainbow Dash is going to be incompetent, but it makes perfect sense. The whole point of what cutscene incompetence means is it's incompetence where it doesn't make sense. Where someone has picked up the stupid ball so that the plot can continue. That's cutscene incompetence. And that's exactly what this is. I'll talk about the rainbow thing in just a second. Quick aside, you know I like to look up actors. Caballero, I'll get used to it at some point, is voiced by the same guy who does Bulk Biceps in this very show. You know, yeah, that guy. But what's doubly interesting and amusing about that is he also voices a Chaos Lord and several other characters over in Warhammer 40k. Now, you're probably thinking, why is that relevant? So the guy who voices Aoi Zodal also voices Ryuk over in Death Note, and Gorguts Edunta from Warhammer 40k. I had to share that because that amused me tremendously. Anywho. They're both... There's a series of games called Dawn of War, which are Warhammer 40k games, some of my favorite Warhammer 40k games. And I just found it amusing that both of these actors, by complete coincidence, both actually voiced characters over in that. Significant characters, plot characters over that. Anyways, I'm getting off topic. And yeah, so it would be extremely easy for Twilight to just be like, time out. We actually do... So I was thinking about this a bit. Obviously, they've lost the elements of harmony, so they're not quite the same level of superpower that they used to be. But they're still pretty good in a fight, especially together, as shown in this episode, actually. At the end of the episode, the group working together absolutely curb stomps Aoi Zodal and his henchmen. Because of course they do. They've worked together for years, however long at this point. They have the teamwork thing, they have the friendship angle, each of them has their own skills, and blah, blah, blah. They're a good team. It would have been effortless for them to just kind of roll over Caballero and his tiny little band if they chose to. But, moving on. So what then happens is an interesting form of exposition. I don't see this type of exposition very often. What happens is Rainbow Dash and Twilight argue at each other about the plot, and basically get the viewers up to speed on what's happening with this particular episode of Daring Do. It's actually surprisingly well done, the way they present that, and the way that they kind of go back and forth on that. It's very quick, very efficient. It makes sense that they would do it in character. And even Pinkie Pie in the background is just going, yep, nope, that makes sense. Yeah, I'm with it. I just wanted to give special praise there, because it's so rare to see actual decent exposition. Then Twilight says we're way in over our heads. Why? Again, I know they don't have the elements anymore, but as I've already mentioned, this is not above their pay grade. In fact, to be completely blunt, this is below their pay grade. But whatever. This leads to Rainbow Dash being incompetent. Now, this is the part I want to talk about most, because this actually makes perfect sense to me. Rainbow Dash has 1 HP. How many of you ever played an RPG? Or any video game where you have a health meter, really? And not any, there's some exceptions to this. But, in Mega Man, if the boss you're fighting has 1 pip of health left, they're still more than capable of beating the crap out of you. They're going full tilt. In RPGs, to go back to the original example, usually enemies that have 1 health are fine. They can just smash face and wreck face, and usually in most RPGs, bosses actually get harder when they have less HP rather than more. But the reason I bring this up is because that's a real-life concept, too. And Rainbow Dash is a great example of this. The HP in this case is her confidence. Now, we've actually talked about this before. Rainbow Dash has a sliver of confidence. While it's there, she's fine. While she believes in herself or has some reason to push, no issues. And she can and has accomplished many substantial and legitimately heroic feats when either the chips are down or because she knew she could. But the catch is that confidence is effectively fake. As we've talked about before, she pushes herself to prove constantly that she can do these kind of things, when in fact she is constantly doubting whether or not she can. This is actually going to come up later in, I don't remember if it's this season, I guess I can scroll down a bit here. It's going to come up later, in addition to the fact that it's already come up prior to now. Looks like it is later in this episode, later in this season we'll actually have it. I bring all that up because what we're seeing here with Rainbow Dash and her incompetence is she's lost her last hit point. With the confidence gone, she's a bumbling, inept idiot. Because that's all that's really been allowing her to do the kind of feats that she does. We see this multiple times. We see this in how she has no idea how to interact with someone else, as she just kind of fans around J.K. Rowling, wow, A.K. Yearling during Do. And I'll talk about that in a second. We see it in how she has no idea how to deal with the fight and how she just interrupts with the fight rather than actually, assisting. And we see it finally when she just wants to walk home. When she just gives up. Like, no, I'm done. I'm where I shouldn't be. Because that confidence is at 0. And we see at the end of the episode what she's like when she gets that 1 HP back. That being said, the awkward scene was awkward. In other news, water is wet. But seriously, watching her, I'm your biggest fan. Oh, watching that is painful. And I kind of want to elaborate on that a bit, if you'll forgive me. Because I've seen that from a pack of 12 ninjas before. Now, a pack of 12 ninjas is one of the most terrifyingly horrifying groups you can ever find. Like, one ninja is pretty bad, but a pack of 12 ninjas is horrifying. Also, what's Halo Wars 2? Because, to my knowledge, we only have Halo Wars 1 on the list. And thank you very, very much for the sub, as always. Much obliged and appreciate. Thank you, sir. I've seen both sides of that. The sequel, so hang on. We may have to stop and chat with a pack of 12 ninjas and explain something to them, so give me a second here. Give me a second. I gotta verify first. Where's the vault? That's what I thought. Okay, so apparently you haven't heard this in Pack of Dungeons. The list is in lockdown. No new games are being added until the list is substantially smaller. So since Halo Wars 2 is not on the list right now, my answer to that is no. However, Halo Wars 1 is on the list, so if you want me to add that to Halo Wars 1, that's fine. But I want to make sure you understand that going forwards. Yeah, we already have literally over 100 games on the list. We are not adding any new ones. Not until that is a substantially smaller list. But, like I said, Halo Wars 1 is on the list if you want to add it to that. As I've said, I've seen that from from both perspectives. On the one hand, put yourself into the shoes of Patrick Stewart for a second. You got it, Pack of 12 Ninjas. Thank you again. And, you know, a fan comes up and they start being like, ah, you're so amazing and I love what you did and you're such a great actor. And you're just sitting there like, okay. Like, can we not? You know, I'm just, yes, thank you. Like, it's just awkward, embarrassing, and you don't really know what to say. Obviously, actors or writers or creators or whatever, at a certain point, kind of have patterns that they use to get used to these kind of things and how they're going to deal with them. But there's also that just kind of, yep, you just kind of smile and nod. You don't want to be rude, obviously, but it's just, thank you very much, Larian. Very much appreciated and obliged, as always, for your sub. I've put that towards dealer's choice. But then there's the other side of that, which is, this is someone, there's a nervousness, which is hard to explain. I've actually experienced it myself. There's a nervousness that's hard to explain, where it's just, you just kind of lock up a little bit, like, oh my god, that's actually such and such, you know. And, you know, you're just, oh, wow. How do you respond to that? And of course, not everyone can deal with that kind of thing appropriately. Not everyone has either the experience, or the know-how, or the social skills, or the charisma, or whatever to just kind of manage to roll with that nervousness and that uncertainty. And what we get is people like Rainbow Dash. I am your biggest fan. And that's why that scene is interesting to see. Because I really can see both sides of that. And I feel bad for both sides of that. I don't think there's really a good answer there. You can't just expect everyone to have the social graces necessary to deal with that on both sides of things, right? Obviously, there is a line. You know, there's a limit that you should not cross, and certainly there are people who have crossed it, but I feel like pointing out that Rainbow Dash does not actually cross that line here. She's just awkward and uncomfortable because her confidence is gone. Interesting to mention. Well, thank you, Pack of 12 Ninjas, for understanding what I'm talking about. I've met several people before. I've actually met Patrick Rothfuss. I've met, I can't think of his name, the guy who does PvP online. I've met Will Wheaton before. I've met Leonard Nimoy. This was obviously many years ago. There's a bit of a list. And there's always that sort of feeling there. I've spent my entire life studying and understanding how to be around other people and studying people. So I'd like to think I have a decent way of dealing with that. But my point is, I still completely understand that moment of when you're dealing with it, that awkward, hesitant nervousness at meeting someone who you care about. You could say they're famous or not, but that's not really the relevant point, is it? The relevant point is that they matter to you, that they have some significance to you. And you're just kind of, you just lock up a little bit. Oh God, what do I say? How do I say it? Don't want to look stupid. Okay, just need to focus. It'll be okay. Need to stop slapping myself. Whack. You know, interesting to think about. I'm looking at my notes here. That's actually most of what I wanted to talk about in this section was Rainbow Dash and her lack of confidence thing. This is a great episode for showcasing that confidence thing, actually. It's one of the things that really helps drag the episode up, which is good because the rest of the episode's just kind of... Which brings me to my next point. Why is that a load-bearing ring? They remove the final ring from the bottom and the whole statue melts into sand and the whole fortress crumbles. Why? I know I'm expecting some kind of logic from a situation in which putting all of the rings on this statue would also somehow scorch the area with 8 centuries of heat, which also makes absolutely no sense. So, again, I have no idea what I'm on about. Yeah, whatever. I do like one tiny little tidbit. This is one of the few bits of the episode that actually is really well thought out. Right at the end of the episode, they destroy one of the rings. And you're probably thinking, why didn't they do that to begin with? Well, actually, they've already answered that. The reason why she didn't just take the ring and destroy it was because she needed to be taken to where the other rings are, so she can then destroy the fortress and make sure that this will never happen. And now that that has been dealt with, now she can destroy the wing all willy-nilly because its purpose has been served. I thought that was a nice little touch. Basically, yeah, Imperial Star Destroyer. Which still makes no sense. I'm not willing to give it a pass. I'm just pointing it out. Just put a little illogical flag. Move on. The end of the episode, I've noticed this. I hope this isn't a trend. Starts with the entry that's in here. Dear Diary, I had the coolest adventure with the coolest pony ever. Came this close to blowing it because I was so wrapped up in how awesome she was, I almost forgot how awesome I was. Good thing I didn't, because it gave me a chance to show her how important it is to put your trust in some pony else. Now that, she says that in the episode. The actual entry here continues, and I guess I never realized how lucky I am to work with a team who I totally trust. I mean, of course I handle things on my own, but being me, I've gotten into a mess of scrapes, and without my friends, those scrapes would have been a whole lot messier. Never underestimate the power of friends who've got your back. Which is actually kind of neat, because to show, this is the final thing I want to talk about here, to show in direct contrast, when Rainbow Dash tries to help Daring Do, it's a complete mess. And that makes absolutely perfect sense, ignoring the confidence thing I already pointed out. There's also the fact that Rainbow Dash doesn't know Daring Do, and Daring Do doesn't know Rainbow Dash, and Daring Do doesn't usually work with people in general. So they have like 3 separate points removed of how to work in a team together. So it makes perfect sense that they would just kind of... This is then shown in contrast at the end of the episode when the team, not Daring Do and Rainbow Dash, but the other 5 have absolutely no problems. I mentioned this already. No problems just rolling over all the opposition because they're familiar with working in a team, right? Interesting tidbit. But that is all I've got for this week. Now, this episode is by Dave Polsky. And, so Act just asked a question. Back when this was released, lots of people took issues with Daring being actually real all along. Personally, I am one of them. Can I ask your position on this? The reason I hesitated so much is I'm not sure I even have a thought on that. It's such a non-issue to me that it didn't even occur to me to comment on it. I suppose if I was to comment on it from a distant and third-party perspective, because as I already mentioned, I had no personal feelings in the matter, what this does is allow them to write stories for Daring Do that can actually have the main 6 involved, or some party members thereof, and thus they could have adventures that are more tangible rather than just reading about the adventures. Now, that's just kind of a because, and this is just my opinion, but back when during the reading episode, when Daring Do was first introduced, I had no problem with them just reading, basically Rainbow Dash narrating the episode, and actually discussing and showcasing it, and basically us kind of getting caught up. There's nothing wrong with a show within the show, basically. Let's just call that what it is. There's nothing wrong with that within reason, especially if you do it as kind of an extensive thing. Now, there are ways to screw that up. Star Trek Voyager is a perfect example of how to completely screw that up, because there's a show within a show, which is this Victorian romance novel thing that Janeway goes to periodically. Now, the problem with that was multifold. First of all, the show within the show had nothing to do with Janeway, problem number 1, so it was completely disconnected. Problem number 2 was the fact that it's a bit of a leap. And problem number 3 is there was nothing actually engaging happening about it. You remember how I mentioned earlier the slice of life concept? And how you need to still focus on stakes? the Victorian romance novel thing had no stakes. That was the problem. There's 3 problems with it. Now, to completely contrast that, to continue using Voyager as an example, Dr. Chaotica. Much later in the show, they came up with this guy called Dr. Chaotica. And that worked very well, because it did the exact opposite of the 3 points I just mentioned. It was substantially relevant to both Harry Kim and Tom Paris's characters, and, it actually showed parts of them and allowed them to interact with each other. It was substantially connected to the overall shtick of Voyager. Someone watching a Star Trek show is probably going to at least be partially on board with watching a pulp 50s sci-fi. And there were actual stakes as presented within, right? Now, I don't want to get into specifics because that gets into spoiler territory for anybody who doesn't watch Voyager. But my point being, it was still a show within a show, and it still worked. In short, I think it would have been fine if they had continued to keep the Daring Do thing just as a novel that they narrated. However, now that I've gone all this way out of my way to explain what is not my point, that being said, literarily speaking, as a writer, you have opened one additional doorway by the fact that Daring Do is actually real, because now you can do adventures for Daring Do that also include the cast. And they do this. Obviously, this episode does this. There's a future episode which also discusses fandom. Go figure. But there's an episode even further in the future, which I want to say is season 6, where they go to the desert town. And, they start learning about the old ancient people of Awesome. The Sphinx thing. You know what I'm talking about. And that kind of an episode wouldn't be able to be done if Daring Do wasn't real, because the connection points wouldn't have been there, and it wouldn't have allowed for the building up of the real history in that episode, which then came forward in the end of season 6 or 7 or whatever that was. Does that make sense? Basically, I can see why people are upset about it, even though I myself am not. Now, the fact that... So, okay. Let's add 3 other things on top of this. First of all, I probably would have changed Daring Do's appearance. We already talked about the whole, palette swap thing. But the problem is, Daring Do really is an obvious direct palette swap of Rainbow Dash. In a series where everyone's... I mean, as pointed out earlier, since everyone's technically a palette swap of each other, if it's that obvious, it's probably a problem. It made perfect sense back in the reading episode. Now, because, self-insert, duh. Now it's just kind of like... So, change your visual design. Point number 1. Point number 2, Rainbow Dash being on the cover as Short Round, haha, by the way, was obviously a reference to Indiana Jones and was a way to write her into the story. But considering that... What I took from that is that Rainbow Dash isn't actually in the story. It's some other Pegasus who is based on Rainbow Dash that's written in to kind of, equate to the same thing and blah, 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 blah. So that doesn't particularly bother me. The third thing that I think could be done here to adjust this is actually bothering to explain some of the why. To my knowledge, they never explain why Daring Do actually releases books about herself. I could be wrong about that. I have theorized that she does that to fund her adventures, but I don't know if that's actually true. That just makes sense to me. So actually putting that on display, putting that out for viewers to be like, oh, okay, would make a little bit of sense. So... Either way... We'll probably address this exact same point in the future because, yeah, we've got to get to the other fandom episode. I don't know when that is. With the convention episode, which I'm actually not looking forward to talking about that one, but whatever. We'll get there. We'll get there. Yeah, I agree. Either way, they should have thought this through long term. And they obviously didn't, which is a shame, because long-term thinking is one of the things I really like in fiction. How do I rate this episode? I've actually been thinking about this for a bit. I think I'm going to give it a straight average. There are parts of this episode I actually really do legitimately like. And then there's parts of this episode that's actually just... What? As I already mentioned, as Larian pointed out as well, the obvious cutscene incompetence scene, the idiot ball scene, bothered the crap out of me. The presentation of, you know, of unpleasant fandom. I wouldn't say toxic. This isn't toxic. Toxic's worse than this. But the unpleasant fandom was just kind of like, okay. And they didn't actually even bother to really discuss or showcase the differences there, or actually discuss the nature of fandom, which they actually will in the future. Well, like I said, we'll get there when we get there. And too much of the daring do stuff was basically just, hey, look, Indiana Jones with ponies, without really actually doing anything with it. So yeah, I'm gonna give this a straight average. I'm not super impressed. Yeah, no kidding. How do you want your name pronounced? Every single time I look at your name, I think of 3 different ways to pronounce it. We're gonna solve this right now. We're gonna set it in stone. It's gonna be done. It'll be awesome. With pie, cake. Maybe cheesecake. Do you guys like cheesecake? I'm cool with cheesecake. That's too high. There we go. You want cheesecake? Cookies? We can do cookies. The main 6 should be celebrities, absolutely. At this point. I mean, holy crap. In fact, they kind of become celebrities in future episodes, but this is purely from memory, but by memory they just sort of are celebrities without ever having become celebrities in the future. And usually there's kind of a build-up to that sort of a thing, rather than just suddenly, oh my gosh, it's them, you know. And I have a feeling they also are going to, you know, bring things up and then drop them immediately in the future, so that should be fun. I suppose in the interest of fairness, this does qualify as a continuity counter for Daring Do. Yeah, that does qualify. I'm only going to give it the 1. We're actually up to 70. No, I'm going to argue myself. I'm actually going to give this episode another continuity counter. I'm sorry. Don't hate me. Just because I'm ugly. Yeah, no kidding, we out. Which is funny, because we've seen how gossiping these people tend to be. You'd think they'd be kind of like... I was debating that. So the cutscene comments, the positive... I think of continuity as a positive. What the hell do you want from me? The addition of the continuity counter there is for the Rainbow Dash lack of confidence thing. That is exactly right. That is perfectly in character for her and slides in neatly with how she's already been built up to this point. That's good continuity, in my opinion. It's one of the things that really helps salvage this episode. But counter continuity of them all just sitting around me, I think I will agree with that. We will give a negative. Let's be honest, that's kind of what that is. To the fact that they have a scene of just blatant, flagrant cutscene incompetence there. No, Spike! He's the one... We'll get there. We'll get there. Either way, I'm going to go and chop off. I got some work to get done. I have a lot of work to get done today. So I hope you guys have enjoyed. I will see some of you tomorrow for Persona 5. We might be having the Star Trek game tonight. I'm not even going to promise that, but I'll release an announcement on Discord if we actually are, and Twitter. And otherwise, like I said, I'll see you guys tomorrow for Persona.